Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS office hours. Today is Monday, March 16th of 2026. Looking ahead here, we have a 5-game NHL slate to go along with a 6-game NBA main slate. So should be a fun day of DFS. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Andrew. I'm one of the coaches over here at SaberSim. This is a show where we go over how to use the SaberSim app, answer any and all DFS related questions, get your questions in. 1 of 3 ways here. First off, send us an email, support@sabersim.com. Second, post it live in the YouTube chat. Third way, post it in the office hours channel in our Discord server. If you're not in our Discord and want to get access to that channel, there is a link in the description of this video. You also get access to our similar channels, individual sport channels, and you get access to the rest of the SaberSim team. Just can't say enough good things about the Discord. But with that said, we do this show Monday through Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and then we do this show on Saturdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, so you can tune in any one of those days to get your questions answered. All right, we haven't had an office hours show for a couple of days here. Is out of town, so last show was Wednesday. Happy to be back in the saddle. Appreciate you guys not forgetting about me while I was gone. I do have a couple questions to get to here today. We'll just kind of start there and then see where the show goes. So got the NBA main slate pulled up for today, and we are going to get into our first question. Came in from Raider Mike in Discord, and the question says, "What's up, Andrew? I know this is probably personal preference, but without overriding the Sims too much, how many leverage/pivot plays do you usually want in each lineup, and what's the best way to get to them, boosting projections or setting min-max exposures? If boosting, how much of a bump would be too aggressive?" Okay, very good questions here. So I think a good place to start, and I think this is like a pretty solid starting point, right? Especially like getting used to SaberSim, wanting to start making adjustments and things like that, right? I always say try and do somewhere between your top 3 to 5 adjustments, right? What you're doing is you're putting in your takes, which are like those, 3, 5 min-max exposures, projection adjustments. We'll talk more about that in a second. But focus on like those key pieces, right? Those pieces that matter to you, that you identify as important to the slate, and then work those takes in, and then let SaberSim fill out the rest of the lineups, right? Like an NBA lineup has 8 players in it. Okay, you put in a couple takes to work in your guys, but what about the rest of the lineup, right? So what I think is like the best approach is where you give SaberSim some of your takes kind of up front, and then you let it do what it does best and build the best lineups around those takes. So there's 2 ways you can kind of work in your takes. Those are going to be projection adjustments and exposures, like you mentioned here, right? So the second part is kind of figuring out how or when to use them, right? And this part is going to be in my opinion, it is the approach that you want to take. And there are more extreme approaches, and then there are less extreme approaches. So a very extreme approach would be, let's say I'm building a group of 20 lineups, right? Okay, so I'm going to come in here, and I have a group, and we'll just use Uniques 1, and I'm going to use SaberScore, and I'm going to build 20 lineups, right? Well, I think one of the most aggressive things that you could do is say, hey, I want to use a core group of players in every lineup, right? So let's say I want to use somewhere between, let's say 3 players, right? Hey, I want to use these 3 players in every lineup as my core. People, that's what people will call it. And then let SaberSim build out the rest. Okay, well, like a way of doing that, you could do it with rules. So I could go to a rule. I would do group manual. I'm going to say use at least 3. And then I'm going to put these 3 players in the group. And let's just say I pick, the highest value player. We'll say Ryan Nemhard. I pick maybe the highest projected player, Jalen Johnson. And then I pick someone in between. And maybe I pick Nickeil Alexander-Walker. I'm just picking a couple guys here. All right, so I click save. Now I have this group. I'm going to save it one last time. Well, when I build this team now, when I click build lineups, all 500 lineups are going to have these 3 players in them, right? You're not telling SaberSim the whole lineup. You're telling it 3 out of 8, right? That is one way of working in your takes. That is like the most aggressive way. A second, maybe less aggressive way of doing that would be using minimax exposures. The reason that this is less aggressive is because with the rule, you are forcing those players to be in 100% of lineups, right? All over the lineups. With the minimum exposures, for example, this is a percentage of the lineups. You know, I could say, hey, I want Jalen Johnson in 50%, right? This is less, this is half as what the rule would do, right? That's already less aggressive. There is a different way of thinking about minimax exposures, which in my opinion, this is the better way of doing it. So let's say that I set a minimum exposure of 21% to Jalen Johnson. And then I set a minimum exposure of 21% to Josh Giddey, right? Well, both of them are the same value minimum exposure-wise, but the exposures are not equal. And the reason for that has to do with their ownership, right? Ownership is so important in DFS. Well, when Jalen Johnson is 7% owned, 21% minimum exposure is 3 times as much ownership, as much as the ownership, right? So like in your lineups, you'll have 3 times as many shares as other users will, because 7 times 3 is 21. You do 21% to Josh Giddey, well, you're actually under the field because we're expecting 35% of lineups to have him. So like the exposures alone aren't equal. You have to reference the ownership of the players, right? So always be aware of the ownership. So what I would do, right, is like say, hey, I like these players and I want to be over the field on them. Well, those are 2 different things, right? So here I could say, hey, I want to have twice as many shares of these players as the field. Okay. So then for Johnson, I put him at 14%. And then for Giddey, I put it 70%, right? These ratios are now equal, even though the exposures are different. So keep that in mind when setting exposures. That also works opposite, right? That works on the maximum exposure side as well. Let's say that, you know, I want to be no more than the field. You know, I want to be at most equal. Okay, then I would set Jalen Johnson to about 8%, and then I would set Josh Giddey to 36, right? And so even though I'm going to have, you know, 1/3 of my lineups could have Giddey, well, I'm going to play him at a similar rate as the field is. So the good idea about doing it this way is that keep in mind that playing a player at the same percentage as their ownership means that when they do good, the same ratio of your lineups is closer to winning as the rest of the field, as the rest of the lineups in your contest. And when they do bad, the same amount of your lineups on average are effectively like eliminated from winning the contest, right? So by playing it this way, you know, leverage works in terms of like absolute value. So if a player is 10% owned, well, having 15% exposure and having 5% exposure are the same stands in different directions, right? One is just a positive stand and one is a negative stand. So it'll start at the 15% and then positive leverage goes up and then negative leverage goes down. But always keep in mind how that exposure and ownership work. That's why, like, when I set up my columns, and I'll build some lineups for this right now. So, you know, these columns, right, you can move them around. You know, I can grab it and I can drag this way, that way. I can right click on the columns. I can go over to this menu on the right, click edit, and then I can move them around this way with this little drag and drop. I just pick it up and I can, you know, move it this, that way, or the other. And then I can save it here, right? When I set up my columns, this is a small thing, but I think, if you're not doing it, I think it's a good idea. Okay, and this shows it even though these lineups aren't loaded. I like to keep my ownership, my exposure, and my leverage very close together. That's my preferred way of looking at this. I can look at the ownership. Hey, what is this player's ownership? Oh, they are 28% owned. What is my exposure to that player? And am I positively or negatively leveraged? And how much is that, right? This makes it very easy to see, hey, my leverage is 36. The ownership is 28. I'm over 2x the field on this player, right? I can compare these things very close together. And then you can also sort by leverage, right? Hey, I want to look at my stands on players and then my stands against players. Here, Najee Marshall is 22% owned. I have 5%. I'm negative 17, right? So I'm almost half. Or I'm actually, no, I'm more than half, right? Half would be 11 and I'm negative 17. So just things to keep in mind, ways of looking and setting things up. If this doesn't make sense to you, find a way that does. But my point is, don't let these columns get lost, somewhere way over here on the right. And then when you pop out your lineups, those columns kind of get covered up. I think that these are just important columns to be aware of kind of at all times is the point I'm trying to make there. All right, so we've covered minimax exposures. We've covered rules. Now, the last part of this that we need to cover are the projection adjustments, right? Because you asked about boosting projections. If boosting, how much would be too aggressive? So what I like to do is I like to run a build first. And then I like to see what exposures I'm getting to that player. So let's say, you like, for instance, today, you like Trey Murphy, right? Trey Murphy is a little bit of positive leverage, not a lot. He's 23% owned. We're getting 30% automatically. And we have a very small positive leverage. Well, you think he's a really good play today. All right. How do you adjust? How do you start this, right? I would recommend starting with like a 1 to 2 fantasy point adjustment. Okay. So go into the projection. I'm going to change him and I'm going to do 2 points, right? Okay. From 38.13, I'm going to go to 40.13. So I've done a 2-point boost here. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, now that I've applied this boost, is I am going to rebuild the lineups. Now, the only time I wouldn't do this, well, no. Okay, so if you are on starter, you should change the projection and then you should rebuild the lineups all the time. If you are on ultimate, changing the projection and clicking build again is the best option. If you are in a time crunch and you are not sure you will be able to finish the next build, then what I would do is rerun the contest sim. So I'll say that again. So on starter, change the projection, rebuild lineups. On ultimate, change the projection, rebuild lineups is best unless you're in a time crunch. If you're in a time crunch, change the projection and just rerun the contest sim. Those are the options that I would present are like probably best here. We're doing the rebuild lineups one, which is the best option. And so now we're going to let these lineups load. So the reason I wanted to run a build first was because I wanted to get basically like a baseline exposure for Murphy. Hey, what is the sim giving on its own? And that better allows us to figure out how big of an impact our projection adjustment has. So here, Murphy went from 30% exposure to 45%. Now we are almost 2x the field on his ownership. And I like this. right? This is kind of why I've messed around with this enough to know like 1 to 2 points is like a good starting point. Now, let's say you did an adjustment and Murphy went from 30 to like 90% exposure. Well, at that point, I think at that point, maybe we have hijacked the sim too much and we were a little too aggressive with our adjustment. And I don't think 2 points usually does that. But if it did, right, I might want to go back here and say, well, let's try a 1 point adjustment and then rebuild lineups again. So it might take a little bit of trial and error. But with the projection adjustments, you're not guaranteed. There isn't like, hey, 1 point equals this much more exposure. 2 points equals this much more exposure. It's a little bit up to the sim to kind of figure out what are the new best exposures for a player. And I've been in a situation, multiple times where I'm like, okay, I think this player is going to score a little bit more. I boost their projection and their exposure doesn't change or barely changes. And, maybe I went from, out of 20 lineups, maybe I went from having them in one lineup at 5% to having them in two at 10%, right? And, maybe I'm still under the field, like in that scenario. So projection adjustments are the least aggressive. Well, projection adjustments can be the least aggressive because you're still not telling the builder what to do. With exposures, you are, right? It's a very blunt force tool. It gets you this percentage of a player in a positive or negative direction, depending if it's min-max. It is much more straightforward, right? Projection adjustments aren't as straightforward, still leaves the control in the builder's hands as to figuring out what the best exposure is. But, if you get too crazy with the adjustments, then you're basically hijacking the sim at that point. And that's up to you, how convicted you are in the adjustment, why you're making it, so just make sure that to start with a softer touch and then adjust further as needed. So I think that one wraps that one up. Really good question to get us started. All right. Next question coming up. Next question. Hey, Andrew, when your contest sims are running slow and it's a time crunch to get them in, do you just cancel the sim and get the best SaberScore lineups in? Thanks. Okay. Good question. So I'll tell you guys what I do. I have a backup template. What I will do is something like this. Something like this. I call it just like percentile fallback, where it uses 95th percentile and it sorts my lineups by that. So if worst case scenario, I need to get my lineups in or I'm going to miss lock. Like missing locks is the worst thing you can do. I will cancel the sim. I will use the percentile template. I'll just switch over really quickly. It puts all of the contests in one group. It does it, it's just, hey, one group, all the lineups. It is unique lineups, and then it uses 95th percentile. So I like to do that just in a worst case scenario. I have had to use it before. I think it's something that is a good idea to have, whether you use a percentile, whether you use projected score, whatever you want to use. I like the percentiles, so that's what I choose to use. But yeah, that is my advice there. And then also, let's say you do that right and you're not sure why your sim is messing up. Just do yourself a favor, jump over to the contest tab really quickly and make sure all of these fields are filled out. The entrance, the percent to first, the cash percent, the user entries, and the field lineups. The field lineups one is really important. I've seen a scenario where, a field lineup wasn't chosen, right? Maybe somebody was simming against a build and they reran the build that they were simming against. Well, if you rerun a build, you need to come into the field lineups and reselect it, because in the field lineups, you had a set of lineups And then when you rerun the build, you essentially trash the old set to get a new set. Well, you need to tell SaberSim, hey, I want to use the new set. So like that's the way that works. So I've seen a situation where the field lineups get lost. So just keep that in mind. Jump over here, make sure all of these fields are filled out, and then jump back to your build and rerun the contest sim would be my advice. All right. Next question. Hey, Andrew, what are the cons of just using the sims and not changing anything and uploading to a contest? I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. I think that if that is the approach you want to take, that is cool. Like that goes with our baseline advice. I think, we talk about the other opposite end of that, right? Like we were kind of talking about that in the first question here, is just because people have takes, and they want to work them in, right? And that's part of the attraction of DFS. Hey, do you know this sport, better than the other people playing in your contest, right? And I think that draws a lot of people in. If you're like, hey, I want to trust SaberSim, I want to use these tools that not everyone else is using, that is a totally fine approach as well. And maybe you're trying to learn a new sport, and maybe you started playing DFS and you started playing football, and now you're trying to branch into other sports. Maybe you don't know that much about it, right? Hey, maybe I'm trying hockey, and I don't have all of like the ball knowledge and like the same kind of background as I do with NFL. Is it okay to just take what SaberSim gives me and play that? Yes, it is, right? We have very smart people who do know these sports, projecting the sports, coming up with the model, figuring out the best correlations to use as far as sliders and the stacks that you're going to need, right? So it is totally okay to take what the sim gives you, not make any changes, and roll with it from there. All right. That was our last question here in the YouTube chat. Basically did a demo here on NBA talking about min exposures, max exposures, rules, projections, leverage, and kind of how to analyze all of that. I think we are all set. Appreciate you guys tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow, Tuesday, 4 p.m. Eastern for our next show. So until then, everybody, take care. Good luck. Thanks.